hello. Welcome to this evening's event for Clapham Book Festival. Thank you all so much for joining us with our chat with top travel writer Shafik Meghji in conversation with book festival organizer and writer Julie Anderson about his much praised book, Crossed Off the Map, which blends travel writing, history and reportage to tell the story of Bolivia's influence on the world. Shafik has co-authored more than 40 travel guides to destinations across Latin America, Asia, Europe, North Africa and Oceania. And so I shall hand over to Julie. I'm Tina Lofthouse. I'm the editor at Time and Leisure magazines, and we're delighted to be media partners for the festival. I'm also joined by Lucy Kane, publisher of Time and Leisure. So over to Julie.
Thanks, Tina. Well, just to start off and ask you a little bit about you, Shafik. As we mentioned before we started, you're a South Londoner, but not in Clapham now, but I believe you have been in the past.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I'm a proud South Londoner. I grew up in Tulsa and Streatham, so very, very close to Clapham. And yeah, I spent a lot of my 20s living in Clapham North, actually. Now I've made the massive jump all the way over to Hither Green in southeast London, but not too far away, But yeah, Clapham's a place that's very close to my heart.
Well, you definitely qualify as local anyway. So now you started out as a reporter on the Evening Standard, I believe.
Yeah.
So I mean, you always wanted to make your living out of words?
Yeah, I mean, topically, when I was a kid, I always wanted to be a footballer, and then sadly, when that didn't work out, I wanted to do what I thought would be the next best thing, which would be a sports reporter. You know, and this was all decided as a teenager, so you know, I was lucky to to get that role at the Evening Standard. I was covering football and cricket, as well as doing some news reporting. And I loved it for a bit. I was, you know, as I say, I always wanted to do it, but you know, I was working there for about a year and a half or so, and then Wanderlust kicked in, and I'd never taken a gap year, so I kind of, you know, almost on a whim decided to resign, and I went backpacking around India and then around South America for the best part of a year, and yeah, and absolutely loved it. You know, used guidebooks while I was there. I thought, God, who writes these books? That would be a great gig. I wonder if I can do it. And yeah, in a roundabout fashion, when I got back to London, yeah, I managed to do it. And then I got my foot in the door, and you know, here we are now. Pretty much 15 years later. Yeah.
No, it's interesting though, because I read you wrote an article recently for the Author magazine called "What Posh White Men Do." I think, in which you pointed out that most of the people who write books about foreign climes and travelling are of a certain type. And I mean, is that changing now?
Yeah, I mean, the headline, of course, is slightly tongue in cheek, but
yeah, of course.
but yeah, no, the article was really, it was a positive article about how, you know, travel writing, like lots of forms of, you know, of journalism in the media, has, you know, is often dominated by, you know, particular demographics, but that over the last 10 years or so in travel writing, that started to change, and we're getting, you know, stories from authors from a wide range of diverse backgrounds. You just have to look at some of the you know, some of the award shortlists and the award winners for that, and actually that you know, this refreshment of the genre is really positive, and actually there's loads of great stories that haven't been heard before. You know, people and communities are being focused on who perhaps haven't before, and you know, and it's more diversity, you know, in all senses of it is always a good thing. And so it was a it was a positive story about how travel writing as a whole is developing and moving forward.
Yeah. No, and whilst we're on the subject of the awards, I should say that in fact you've been listed for several and got to the final 3 of the Travel Writers Award for 2022, Narrative Travel Book of the Year. So congratulations for that. And I know that several of your articles are also up there for awards for Wanderlust and Journey Travel and so on, and I believe that Crossed Off the Map is listed for another one as well, isn't it?
Yeah. So it's been, you know, it's been lovely to be, lovely to be up for a few awards this year. Yeah, Crossed Off the Map was shortlisted for the British Guild of Travel Writers Narrative Travel Book of the Year. Sadly, was just pipped at the post, but it was lovely to be shortlisted. Yeah, and it's also up for a outdoor book of the year for the Great Outdoors magazine, which is also lovely, and which incidentally is open to a public vote. So you can actually
vote for me
if you enjoy the talk, and it sounds like an interesting book, of course.
Yeah, well, it is an interesting book, and I wanted to ask you why you decided to write a book, because it's a very different style of writing. From, I know you've done travel guides, but invariably those have been with other people, and actually taking on a whole book. I know because I write, so taking on a whole book yourself is a different order of things. Why did you decide to write the book, and why about Bolivia?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm an inveterate reader. I've always loved reading, narrative travel books. So I've kind of always, as soon as I started writing about travel, I kind of had it in mind that I'd like to do this form of writing as well. As you say, I'd had a lot of experience writing with co-authors and so on, and with, with very, the teams of editors and stuff. So suddenly when you're starting out on your own, it's both liberating and great, and you have so much freedom, but it's also obviously a little bit daunting. And I did miss, particularly when you've got those days where the words just won't come, not being able to turn to a co-author to pick up the slack. So I've kind of always had an interest in that form of writing, and this specific book was really inspired. The impetus initially for it was my very first visit to South America, back in 2004, after I'd left the Evening Standard and I was just backpacking around. And at that point, I didn't really know much about Bolivia at all. I'd gone to Rio for Carnival, which was wonderful, and then I wanted to hike the Inca Trail to Machu Picchu in Peru, and then essentially needed a cheap, easy way to get from one to the other. And Bolivia sits between those two countries. So it was just, well, we'll just travel through, and didn't pay too much attention. But pretty much as soon as I crossed the border, I got hooked on this place. It's, initially it was the incredible dramatic landscapes. It's got the world's highest navigable lake, Lake Titicaca. It's got the world's largest salt flat, the Salar de Uyuni, which is roughly the size of Jamaica. It's got the world's most biodiverse national park. It's got a huge swathe of the Amazonian basin. It's got beautiful rural cities. It's got desert. It's got almost everything that you can imagine. And kind of as I was traveling across it, experiencing these incredible landscapes, and also finding out more about the history, the cultures, the people of this place, which I didn't really know much about before, which I think is probably true, for most people now. I was really captivated by the place. So that was the initial spark for the book. And then, scroll forward a few years later, I'd become a guidebook author for Rough Guides. And I got the chance to work on the Rough Guide to Bolivia. And that gave me the perfect excuse to travel across the country to almost every corner, paid for by Rough Guide. So I could, use that as an excuse to get everywhere. And while I was doing that, the book became more fleshed out in my mind, and I started doing the research, I started doing the writing, and and then spiraled forward to earlier this year, and the book's out on the shelves.
Yeah, and it is, and I mean, I can see it behind you, but I've got it here as well, and I enjoyed it as well. Terrifically. It was excellent, and I've got lots and lots of questions about it. But can you first tell me about the title? Why is it called Crossed Off the Map?
Yeah, so this was one of the stories that I first heard on my first visit, and it kind of it just drew me in. So there's an apocryphal story from the mid-19th century about a British ambassador in the city of La Paz, and there's a diplomatic spat with the dictator, the Bolivian dictator at the time, who was a guy called Melgarejo, who was a eccentric character, to say the least. So there was this diplomatic spat, and the ambassador, it resulted in the ambassador being stripped naked, tied to the back of to a donkey or an ass, and then paraded around the main square in La Paz, and then kicked out of the country. And then, according to the story, which is known as the Black Legend, when Queen Victoria hears about this, she flies into a rage. She orders the Royal Navy to bombard La Paz, and then she's told that actually La Paz is hundreds and hundreds of kilometers inland, way up in the Andes. So instead, she asked for a map of South America, and when it's given to her, she ceremoniously crosses off Bolivia's name and declares that Bolivia does not exist. So this is, as I said, this is called the Black Legend. It's quite well known in Bolivia and in South America more generally. Now, it's an apocryphal story. It probably originated in Chile around the time, which has always been had a fractious rivalry with the country. But it felt to me that actually that there's an underlying truth in it, and that actually the story might not be true, but in many ways Bolivia feels like it has been crossed off the map. It's it's this a huge country. It's right in the heart of South America. It's bordered by Brazil and Argentina and Chile, Peru, and Paraguay. But it's often overlooked. It's very rarely covered in the international media. Travel writers that I love reading about in South America often hurried through it en route to somewhere else. It was only ever mentioned in passing. But this is a place with an absolutely remarkable history, as well as fascinating people and as well as dramatic landscapes. So really, I saw an opportunity for to kind of share some of the stories that fascinated me with a wider audience.
Yeah. And it is fascinating. I mean, the history is, because this isn't just a travel book, it does cover everything from sort of prehistory, certainly pre-Columbian or pre-Columbus history, right up to the present day. And I was fascinated by some of the really sort of ancient history, especially I'd heard about the Incas, and anybody who follows drama with Peter Shaffer's Royal Hunt of the Sun and various other plays and dramatizations knows about Atahualpa and the conquistadors and so on. But I knew nothing at all about the civilization that preceded the Inca civilization there. And especially in the Llanos de Mochos, and I'm sure that I pronounced that completely wrongly, but could you tell us about that? That's a sort of the eastern side of Bolivia, isn't it?
Yeah, so the Llanos de Moxos is in the Amazon. I mean, most people will think of Bolivia as an Andean country, but around a third of it lies within the Amazon basin. And and in the eastern section of it is a place called the Llanos de Moxos, and it's seasonally flooded. It's dense rainforest. It's incredibly biodiverse. Now it's very sparsely populated, but has these huge cattle ranches. It's a challenging environment to say the least. I can speak from personal experience of spending many weeks there over the course of the years. But actually, it's over the recent decades. It was long thought that this place was too challenging for complex and sophisticated ancient societies to develop. But in recent decades, that's proved to be absolutely not the case. And there's these remarkable kind of dating back more, well over 1,000 years, maybe as many as 2,000 years. These societies that built these incredible earthworks, perhaps as many as 20,000 earthworks, these raised fields, these raised platforms, these artificial reservoirs, these causeways, and actually not just survived in this challenging environment, but absolutely thrived. Now, because they were made often of mud and that kind of thing, and they've been overgrown subsequently, they don't have the ruins that you might find in Machu Picchu or elsewhere, the Inca ruins in Bolivia. But they've been uncovered recently. Almost every week, something new is discovered there. And that's one of the stories that I explore in the book. I take a boat trip down. I actually, discover some, with a guide, I'm shown some human remains that had been kept in this that had been buried in a funerary urn. And because there's so much flooding and erosion in this place, each year these funerary urns are rising to the surface. And because so little study is there, it's like walking across an archaeological site that feels undisturbed. Mm-hmm. So it was a fascinating story to explore, because there's been so little writing about it, and particularly in English, and particularly to a non-academic audience. Mm. So it was really fun to write about. And also this is one of the myths, or one of the societies that helped to inspire the myth of El Dorado, of a fabulous lost city of immense riches in the Amazon. And actually that dates back to the Inca. So before the arrival of Columbus in the Americas, the Inca had these expeditions into the Amazon to kind of meet these societies. And it's an incredibly rich story, and more and more is coming out about it all the time.
And they backed off as well. That's because they were quite aggressive, the Incas.
Yeah, well, I mean,
they clearly didn't want to mess with the people who were living in the Llanos de Mochos.
Yeah, well, I mean, essentially, it's the oldest written text on this is from a Spanish conquistador, so not necessarily an impartial judge, but the story is that the Inca reached these communities who refused to submit to Inca rule, but said we will exchange ambassadors and we will trade and so on. And I think the Inca were according to the stories, were very impressed with what they found, and there was some trade. And you can see in some of the archaeological findings today that there's some like stone tools and things that could only have come from the Andean region of what is now Bolivia and Peru. Mm. So they were clearly an impressive society. And if you visit this region today, which is very challenging, it's a riverine area. There's lots of erosion. It can be very hot and sticky, but it's also hit by things called a surazo, which are these Antarctic winds that blow up from across Patagonia and plunge the temperatures and soak you, and in gale force winds. It's incredibly challenging now for modern visitor. So you're left with a lot of respect for these these ancient societies that are so little researched and studied today.
And I mean, you don't just look at the pre-Columbian history, but also the post-Columbus period with the conquistadors, and that sort of you have these ancient societies, then you have the Incas, and then of course you have the conquistadors in the 17th century, and you cover one of the things I found fascinating, the different types of wealth in Bolivia, completely different types of wealth, but that's been exploited. I mean, since Inca times, really. I mean, pre-Columbian, but the Spanish seem to take it to a different level. I mean, the one thing that people, if they know anything about Bolivia, tend to know about is the sort of the age of silver and the silver mines, and the Spanish galleons sailing across the Spanish Main full of Bolivian silver, and it's in Cervantes, I believe, that they talk about it's I think he says Vallejo or Potosi. This is worth a Potosi, and Potosi being this mountain of silver in Bolivia. I mean, would you like to tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is one of the stories that that first captivated me, and I couldn't believe I wasn't familiar with it before visiting Bolivia. So Potosi, which is one of the highest cities on Earth. The highest city on Earth is elsewhere in Bolivia, a place called El Alto. So Potosi is more than 4,000 meters above sea level. It's in a very stark location, but rising above it is a mountain, the Rich Hill, Cerro Rico, and that was home to the most valuable silver mine in history. According to legend, so much silver was pulled out of it during the Spanish colonial period that you could have built a set of solid silver railway tracks all the way from Potosi to Madrid, and still have enough silver left over to build an engine to ride on top of it. And this silver changed the world. It helped to fund things like the Great Wall of China. It played a huge role in Europe's development. It brought great riches. But it also caused a demographic collapse in the Andes for the indigenous people, and also for enslaved Africans who were trafficked over to work in the mines and to work in the smelting points. But yeah, and it had, as you say, it had links with Cervantes. It features in Don Quixote. Barley and Potosi is like worth a fortune, essentially. Cervantes was actually I think he applied to be, I think it was either a governor or to have like a role in Potosi, which he didn't get. So, and I think this was before writing Don Quixote. So, you know, maybe if fate had worked out differently, we would have had a Bolivian Don Quixote instead. But now it's an incredible, you know, this funded great, well, Potosi, you know, in an inhospitable environment, 4,000 meters above sea level, you know, a place that literally takes your breath away. But there was these incredible churches, these incredible mansions were built. One street was literally paved with silver during the Spanish colonial period. But, you know, inevitably the silver eventually ran out. And, you know, then there was tin for a while in Potosi, but essentially, you know, the city and this area went into a decline that it's never really recovered from. And, you know, if you visit today, you see incredibly beautiful buildings. You can go deep into the mine itself, which is still working, and really it feels that it hasn't, you know, the mining conditions haven't really changed that much in about 500 years. I mean, my, you know, hour and a half in these mines was, you know, an incredibly intense experience, very claustrophobic, and you know, and it can be dangerous. You know, the miners who still work on these near exhausted seams to, you know, to support their families working, you know, in terrible conditions. But all of this makes, you know, Potosi and, you know, and mountains of this history incredibly rich, really, you know, in all senses. And yeah, if you can acclimatize to the altitude, it's an incredible place to visit, even if you don't go inside the mines. It's a city that literally changed the world. And but you know, now it's largely drifted from consciousness outside of Bolivia. You know, an awful lot of people aren't familiar with it, and but yeah, there's incredible stories associated with it.
I mean, you make a very good case for Potosi silver being the first sort of form of globalization, actually, the way that it's, you know, the Manila galleons from the Spanish carry it halfway around the world to Manila, and the Chinese and the Europeans, and it is a sort of global trade, really. Which is very interesting, because I didn't think of it in that way at all. I mean, I grew up as I think you say somewhere in the book, you know, I grew up with Robert Louis Stevenson stories and Treasure Island and all that sort of stuff. So Pieces of Eight and so on, and to actually realize that this place in Bolivia was, okay, Mexico came along later, but this place in Bolivia was probably the source of a lot of that wealth. And shipped around the globe. But that was when Bolivia had a coastline, I believe. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, so Bolivia is landlocked now, but very much feels the loss of its coastline, you know, like a phantom limb, essentially. Yeah, essentially, the mineral rich, the Atacama Desert, which I'm sure a lot of people will be familiar with in northern Chile and in southern Peru. An awful lot of that, which is incredibly mineral rich, I should say, was once part of Bolivia. But the War of the Pacific, the 19th century war, which again in Europe now people are not so familiar with, but this was an incredibly, one of the most decisive, you know, in significant conflicts in South American history. The upshot was that Bolivia was on the losing side and lost this rich coastline. But you know, it's still, there's still a claim. They still claim it today. There's been claims, you know, with the UN, for example. There's a Day of the Sea that is celebrated in Bolivia each year, where people will, you know, parade and, you know, stake the claim for the sea. You know, particularly if you find maps in Bolivia, you can often find this portion of what is now Chile, you know, as part of Bolivia. So yeah, and it was obviously very significant for, you know, during the, you know, the Spanish colonial period, where all of the borders were, you know, not quite what they are now. But yeah, this silver was, you know, transported by llama caravans all the way to what is now the Peruvian coast, and yeah, and shipped around the world on these Manila galleons. Lots of British pirates and privateers were attacking them, it should be said as well. But yeah, this was the birthplace of global trade. It was the first time that a truly global trading system had been set up. One historian that I quote in the book described the silver that was produced by Potosi, and the silver coins, the pieces of 8, as the Visa and MasterCard of their era. So yeah, so it's a fascinating. So even the the dollar sign that is ubiquitous around the world. The origins of that are from a stamp from the Potosi Mint, which overlays the initials of the city over each other. And I should say that the Royal Mint now, which looks like a fortress, has been turned into a museum. But it's an incredibly evocative place to explore, and it was an absolute pleasure writing about it. I could have written the whole book just on Potosi, really.
No, and it is fascinating. I found it fascinating to read. But I mean, it's not just silver. I mean, you alluded to tin, but I mean, there is a more modern mineral that essentially helps to power the modern world that they're beginning to exploit. I mean, they have exploited for years, but looking to exploit it more. And that's on that high altiplano around the Salt Lake, isn't it?
Yeah, so I mean, Bolivia has been blessed or cursed, depending on your perspective, with incredible natural resources. Obviously, silver. Tin later was a huge resource. It was one of the biggest tin producers. But today, it's the modern counterpart is something that essentially makes this event possible. That makes mobile phones and electric cars and laptops and all of these kind of pieces of technology that we rely on possible, and that's lithium, which is an incredibly light metal. I think it's the lightest metal, and it's essential to these long life batteries. And Bolivia has is part of the lithium triangle. And so in the below the Salar de Uyuni, which is the world's biggest salt flat, the size of Jamaica, an absolutely otherworldly landscape, below the surface, below the thick salt crust, are vast, truly vast lithium reserves that haven't really been exploited fully yet. And there's still lots of kind of artisanal and kind of small scale projects there. But I was fascinated with this story because it's obviously, there's got a lot of, overlaps with the silver story and whether Bolivia can actually exploit these reserves for the benefit of its own people, rather than, these foreign multinationals, but also whether they can do this and also preserve what is an incredible environment, but also a very fragile ecosystem in salt flats. Which is, and it's these kind of debates. It's, lithium is vital if we're going to transition to a low carbon economy, something that we need globally, of course. But this is also, the Salar de Uyuni is incredibly valuable, and precious landscape, and also, has, communities, predominantly indigenous communities that live there, that have harvested salt for thousands of years, and that, it's got very, despite being quite inhospitable, it has incredible wildlife there, including lots of flamingos. So it's the balance of being able to take advantage of these resources, and Bolivia certainly needs the money, but also to protecting these landscapes. And that's one, in the chapter after Potosi, that's what I explore. And it's I traveled across it and kind of spoke to people there and found out people's concerns, and it's a difficult issue. You don't, there's no kind of easy right or wrong answers, and this is incredibly politically controversial as well. It's been said to play a role in changes of governments, and these debates are ongoing at the moment. So I try and wrestle with some of those stories, whilst also giving a bit of a history and a bit of a flavour for this landscape, which is really as close to, it's as close to stepping on another planet as you can get without getting in a spaceship. Essentially, you have these incredible mineral stained lakes, these bright blue, bright red or bright green. You have these geyser fields. You have these lunar landscapes surrounded by volcanoes. You have these islands of giant cacti that are the peaks of ancient volcanic mountains that have, just rising above the salt flat. And then the salt flat itself is just so incredibly flat that it plays tricks on you. And if you go at this time of the year, which is the rainy season, it turns into a giant mirror. So it's covered with a layer of water, and it becomes, it's like being in a surrealist painting or something. It's truly a mind-bending place.
You make it sound absolutely amazing, all these wonderful colours and the reflection and so on. But it also sounds a very challenging place to spend any time. But I guess that's sort of how it is. Now, I could talk to you about climate, the sort of aspects of climate change and the Amazon and so on. But to an extent, that's done and has been done with COP27 recently. So I'd like to move on briefly to talk about some of the cities, actually. And I mean, you talk about. I was fascinated by the sort of the twin cities of La Paz and El Alto. I mean, La Paz itself is quite fascinating because it's spread across a sort of gorge, and it's one of these places where you've got where the rich live in the valley and the poor live on the mountainside. So it's one place where the poor look down on the rich, which I found an interesting inversion. And then you've got El Alto, which is up on the Altiplano, which started out as this sort of poor campesino dormitory place. And has actually completely dwarfed its wealthy sister. So, I mean, would you like to tell us about those?
Yeah, I mean, it's as I say that the landscapes, the natural scenery in Bolivia is fascinating, but actually the urban landscapes and the cities are equally interesting. Yeah, so I mean, La Paz is just a fascinating place in its own right. Like all of Bolivia's Andean cities, it's high altitudes. I mean, in the city center, it's around 3,600 meters. But if you fly into it, it's the highest international airport. El Alto International Airport is over 4,000 meters. And you descend into the this canyon surrounded by these snow-capped Andean mountains, and you descend into it, and you go stuck to the sides of the canyon rim are the poorer neighborhoods, and then the richer neighborhoods are lower down, and for obvious reasons, because it's however fit you are, the altitude takes a real toll on you. So and a few hundred meters below makes a big difference. So so you have a it's almost a perfect visual metaphor of the poor looking down on the rich in this city. But and over the course of the last 30 or 40 years, on the canyon rim, a city called El Alto has developed. Now El Alto is now bigger than La Paz, and it was an informal community of campesinos, people that came from the countryside, often indigenous, generally, Aymara indigenous Bolivians who came from the countryside, fleeing the climate crisis, fleeing droughts, fleeing economic crises. And then, either they couldn't afford, or there was no place for them to live in La Paz when they came to find work. So they essentially, a new city was founded. And it was looked down upon. It's looked down upon today as well by many Bolivians of European descent, and it was ignored by the government for many years. But it's become an incredibly dynamic, vibrant, flourishing place. It's it's a hub of industry, legal and illegal. It has an absolutely huge market. It has one of the biggest street markets in South America, where you can buy pretty much anything if you're shopping there. And it's also got this incredible architectural this indigenous architectural style that has shot up over the last 20 years or so, called choles, which are these it's a combination of of retail space, of these areas for parties and events, which are a huge part of Aymara culture, and then there's also accommodation as well. But these are incredibly multicolor. Some of them are garish, some of them are designed to look like characters from Marvel movies or Transformers or so on. It's incredibly distinctive. There's lots of, there's indigenous Andean iconography. There's materials imported from China. It's a huge amalgam. And it's a distinctly not just Bolivian, but El Alto or Alteño form of architecture. One of my guides who was showing me around there, who really gave me great insight into it, described it as firecracker architecture, which I couldn't better myself. So I borrowed wholesale from her. But these places also see a flourishing indigenous, particularly Aymara, identity as well. So there's incredible, cultural expression, there's incredible festivals, there's incredible, a flourishing of a community of a people who have long been repressed in Bolivia and beyond. So it's also hectic and noisy, and it can be chaotic, and and it's as I say, it's very high altitude and often bracing conditions, but it's a very memorable place. Both of the cities are a very memorable place to visit, and now they're connected by, I think it's the world's largest urban cable car network as well. So people commute up and down the canyon on these on these cable cars, which, if you get a clear day, offer absolutely stunning views for just a few pence equivalent.
Amazing. Just to come back on the point about the Aymara, I was fascinated by them. I mean, because they have a language that predates Inca Quechua, aren't they? I mean, their language is very old, and it's clearly not Indo-European in any way. But I mean, what kind of language is it?
Yes, I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, and really that there's dozens of indigenous languages that are used in Bolivia still alongside Spanish, but Quechua, which is essentially it's the language that most of the Inca would have spoken, and also Aymara, which as you rightly say predates the Inca. It's one of the very few South American languages that has survived in wide usage, both the Quechua-speaking Inca and the Spanish-speaking conquistadors. And for lots and lots of people, it will be their first language. And it's, the construction of it and the words are very, very, very different to any language that most visitors, and certainly most European visitors, will have. But yeah, it's if you learn a little bit of it, it will go, go a long way. Yeah. But the flourishing of the language really is also part of the flourishing of Aymara kind of culture that's happened over the last couple of decades, with Bolivia having the first indigenous president in South America, in Evo Morales, who has now left office. But yeah, but it's really, if you spend time there, you'll get incredible insight into Aymara and Quechua culture, as well as the patchwork of other indigenous communities that live in Bolivia. And that was really something I wanted to write about. I mean, I think an awful lot of travel writing and writing generally about South America, it starts as if history started with the arrival of Columbus, which is clearly not true. And often indigenous communities are talked about as something in a past in a past sense, they talk about their historical achievements, but these are living, vibrant, remarkable cultures that shape Bolivia and beyond today. So I kind of wanted to try and as best as I can provide a window for readers to kind of look through into that.
And you succeed. I mean, I can say that it really does happen, and as is evident from what you're saying tonight, you absolutely adore the country, which also helps. I love the story about that sort of Aymara cultural thing and the clock. The fact that the future is behind you in Aymara, in the Aymara language, future actually means time which is behind you because you can't see it, whereas the past is in front of you because you can see it and you can see what's happened in the past, which is I found as a writer, especially, a lovely example of how the language really epitomizes a cultural difference there. Are there lots of examples like that?
Yeah, I'd say that's absolutely the best example of it, because as far as I'm aware, talking to linguists, that this is incredibly rare, that the words for forward and is associated with past rather than the future or present. And it really does, it feels like that, that the past is a living thing, really, and the idea that the past is in front of you is that, well, I know what happened in the past, I can see it. The future, I don't know what happens in the future, so it's obscure to me, it's behind me, which is, it takes it's difficult even explaining it here. It's difficult to kind of get your head around it if you haven't kind of been brought up in that culture. But it offers like a little window into this very distinct culture. And yeah, as you say, kind of linked to that, there was there's a clock in the square, the same square that the British ambassador was reputedly paraded around naked before being kicked out. But yeah, there's in this square there is there's a clock tower, and there's the clock that goes backwards, which it's both making a political point, and it's also but it's also indicative of peoples that have a different view of the world, that have different perspectives, cultural perspectives and understanding of the world. And it's it's mind-bending stuff.
Well, it's unique though. It's wonderful. It really is. Now, I've got a whole list of questions, as you know, because we've discussed some of them. But I'm sort of very mindful that it's getting towards quarter to. So what I'll do now is actually say what next for Shafik Meghji. I mean, are you going to write more books, or are you going to go back to Bolivia? Perhaps expand on Potosí or one of the other places.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to get back to Bolivia. I haven't been for a few years because of the pandemic, but I would love to get back. As for me, I've kind of I've started thinking and started doing the prep for a new book, which I can't really say too much about, but it's kind of taking a similar approach to Crossed Off the Map and looking at history and present day challenges, but with a wider South America focus. And and as part of that, I'm actually off to Chile and Patagonia on Thursday. So I'm off to do some.
It'll be cold this time of year, I suppose. It's the southern hemisphere, isn't it?
The southern hemisphere. So I'm flying to Santiago, which will be nice weather, and then I'm heading to south Patagonia, which should be nice, but Patagonia notoriously is changeable. So you kind of have to pack for 4 seasons at whatever time of year you visit there. So watch this space for future projects.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for answering my questions. I thoroughly enjoyed your book and can absolutely recommend it to anyone who's watching. And I've got lots more, but I'll stop because I'm sure that lots of people who are watching this want to have asked their own. So if I hand you over to either Lucy or Tina, I'm not sure who's going to take this on. Lucy or Tina.
Hello. So we weren't sure if it was going to be Tina or myself, but I'm going to pick up on the Q&A, and so if you've got any questions, please do put them in the chat, or by all means put up your yellow hand, and then you can ask Shafik in person. But as somebody who has travelled to Bolivia, it's been really fascinating hearing your stories, and actually to put it into a broader context for me, I had a sort of fairly superficial kind of backpacking experience. So actually I can't wait to really kind of broaden my understanding of Bolivia as a whole. But I'm interested to know, what was that first moment or place in Bolivia where you suddenly went, wow, this is somewhere really quite different, quite special? What was it that connected you to the spirit of Bolivia?
I mean, I think my first impression of it was the eastern side of the country, which is the lowlands, the tropical lowlands, which borders Brazil. And I caught the train from the border, which was nicknamed the Death Train, which is for various reasons. One maybe because it transported yellow fever victims, others because people would get drunk, climb on the roof, and then fall off to their death. Others, they're just so boring that people would die. But anyway, I got this train to the city of Santa Cruz, which is really the economic powerhouse of Bolivia. And I kind of arrived bleary-eyed, tired, not had a huge amount of sleep, and kind of walked into the main square. And there, at that time, there were still sloths in the trees of the main square. There was a huge protest, a political protest with banging pots, which is a very classic way of protesting in South America. And if you travel through Bolivia for any length of time, you will come across many protests. But you had that going on, but you had also in the outlying areas, you had Mennonite communities, and so you would see Mennonite farmers coming in. You would see Japanese Bolivians, because there's a big Japanese population there. And it was it wasn't really like any place that I visited at that point. And I thought, oh, this is a fascinating place. And really that was the first kind of the impetus behind, oh, this is a really interesting place. I'm going to want to spend more time here. And then as soon as I got out to see the Salar de Uyuni, the incredible salt flats, going to the Amazon and traveling down these serpentine waterways and swimming with pink river dolphins and, seeing anacondas and, as many birds and monkeys as you can imagine, I just got absolutely captivated by it. So it was those kind of, that kind of landscape that drew me in initially. And then as soon as I heard the stories and the history, well, I was hooked.
It has got an incredible variety of things on offer that's hard to explain. And it is a very hard and challenging place as well. So it seems to have these incredible extremes. And I think you described it as like being on a different planet, being on the salt flats. And that's very much my impression. And then you'll see a lady walking past in a bowler hat. But with all of that in context, what do you think we can learn about the people who are managing to create a life in Bolivia against all odds? Like, is there something that we can learn in the Western world from Bolivia?
Yeah, I think a huge amount. One of the themes of the book is it felt like traveling through Bolivia, it feels like the future had already arrived there in terms of things like the climate emergency, but also populism, national identity, the war on drugs, lots and lots of these issues that will affect all of us and will, help to determine our future over the coming decades. Felt like they were already happening in Bolivia. Bolivia felt like it was on the front line of these places. So I think there's a huge amount to learn. And I'd say definitely, picking out one of them would be, if we're coping with the climate emergency, indigenous communities have a huge amount to teach us about, protecting these environments, preserving them. And and I think we would do well, to listen to them.
Mm-hmm. I just want to read out a comment from Alison, who said, "It's an absolute triumph of a book. Absolutely loved reading it. Such an education, has got me so interested in the rest of Shafik's work." So yeah, it's nice comments.
Thank you very much, Alison. That's lovely.
So just thinking about the rest of Bolivia, there's some kind of dangerous places there as well. So were there any scrapes that you experienced, or were there any moments that what maybe some of your scariest moments?
Well, there were a few scrapes along the way. I would say one particularly memorable thing is that the world's most dangerous road is in Bolivia, and it goes down from La Paz into the Yungas, which is like a subtropical region. And it's a beautiful, spectacular road, incredible views, but it's very, very winding. There's sheer drops on one side. There's loads of fog that will, mist that will billow across it. And huge numbers of people have died, unfortunately, on this road. So traveling along that road was even though actually the journey was fine, was particularly hair-raising, because you're momentarily you're captivated by the views, and then suddenly a motorbike with a family of four will screech past, maybe clipping the wing mirror of your vehicle. So yeah, that was definitely one that springs to mind. Another is from the Salar de Uyuni, which set off one morning in beautiful, beautiful sunlight, and then essentially as we ascended to a pass, which would have been 4,500 meters or so, we were absolutely caught in a blizzard, and actually we had to turn back, and we went back in convoy. We literally had to dig the vehicles out of the snow to keep progressing. And then overnight, which I was in, how shall I put it, rudimentary accommodation, and the temperature dropped to -21 overnight. So that was a challenging environment. But actually, you know what, probably the worst experience is being bitten by mosquitoes. I have, for whatever, mosquitoes love me for whatever reason, whatever DEET factor, jungle strength mosquito repellent I have, it makes no difference. I get bitten to death. But when I've spent time in the Amazon, a region I love, I always get bitten to death. And I think in the Llanos de Moxos, which is where these incredible archaeological sites are, the last time I was there, I stopped counting after 50 bites. Essentially, I was absolutely covered with them, which was in the hot humidity was pretty agonizing. So the mosquitoes will be my worst experience in Bolivia. Yeah.
And with Bolivia being a place of extremes, what were your highs?
I mean, the literal highs are going up to these high cities and kind of experiencing a really modern, place like El Alto, and kind of really experiencing a really modern, vibrant, dynamic kind of indigenous culture. I mean, I love Lake Titicaca as well, which we haven't really talked about so much, but there's a wonderful hike. Is an island in Lake Titicaca called Isla del Sol, the island of the sun. And the Inca believed that this was the birthplace of both the sun, the moon, and the Inca dynasty. And it was a pilgrimage route for hundreds and hundreds of years for indigenous peoples. And there's a wonderful hiking route that you can do around this island today. You get a boat across to it, and so I mean that's an incredibly memorable place. But and also the wildlife encounters you get in the Amazon, swimming with pink river dolphins, which are incredibly playful and curious and energetic creatures. That's very, very memorable.
You paint a wonderful picture of it, and it's very inspirational. So I guess when your hope for somebody reading your book would be to go and explore there. What would you say to somebody who's tempted, who's like, you've piqued their interest in their book, but they're thinking of traveling? What would you say to them, to like maybe your tips or that last thing to tip them over the edge to make that decision?
Well, I mean, honestly, the nicest feedback that I've got from the book, the most heartening thing I've got, is from people who've read the book and said they've been inspired to go and visit Bolivia. And in some cases have, a couple of people had actually booked their flight tickets. So my first piece of advice would essentially be, don't try and do too much. I mean, in the whole book, I cover as many landscapes and parts of the country as possible, but that was done over long research trips over many years. So if you're there for a couple of weeks, pick 2 or 3 places and do them really well. If you're going to the Andean side, which you definitely should, take the time to properly acclimatize, even if it doesn't hit you originally. You think this is not fun, but if you take the time to acclimatize properly, which is essentially taking it easy, not drinking too much, or not drinking alcohol, getting plenty of rest, you'll have an incredibly rich experience. So if you fly into La Paz and you can go to the ruins of Tiwanaku, you can go to Lake Titicaca, and then you can travel south. You can get a wonderful train south down the Altiplano, which is this high plateau between 2 branches of the Andes, to the Salar de Uyuni, and then you can see this otherworldly landscape. So you can do that in a week, and then you've still got a week to explore the Amazon. And so Park National Madidi is the most biologically rich, the most biologically diverse place on earth. So it's whenever I'm offering advice for people, I never want to guarantee wildlife sightings, but in Madidi, I can guarantee that you will see incredible wildlife there.
Wow. Well, if that doesn't inspire you, I don't think anything can. And I think you paint an amazing picture of it, and so much information that and making it really accessible as well. Like you say, those shorter trips. So Julie, if you felt inspired, I wonder now if you'll actually be tempted to take it up. Thank you very much. That was an incredible talk, and Julie, wonderful questioning as ever. I think you both brought it to life for us all. We've had a really, really fascinating talk. I'm totally inspired to read your book, and as a visitor to Bolivia, I want to kind of see the sides that I haven't seen. I think your book's going to do that for us. So thank you very much for joining us, Shafik. And Julie, thank you very much for your excellent questions. I've really enjoyed this In Conversation, and Time and Leisure was really delighted to host In Conversation tonight.